Go on and open your Bibles to Matthew 7. We're still in the Sermon on the Mount. We're looking at questions of the Bible. We'll finish this up at the end of April, move into the book of 1 Corinthians. But there, as we said, there's several questions throughout the Bible, and we're just touching the hem of the garment. I think we'll revive the series sometime in years to come. Lord willing, we'll come back and look at some other questions of the Bible. I hope that you found it interesting. I've enjoyed getting these together. Next week, we'll have a guest speaker. I'll be out Sunday morning. I'll be back Sunday night. But we're going to Waverly and speak next Sunday morning. Kind of special day over there. And so we're going to go over there and speak for them and look forward to that. But we are in the Sermon on the Mount, as we said, and we want to look at Matthew chapter 7. I sound a little bit like holla. Y'all might say, well, he's always holla-headed. But the allergies have finally kicked in. So I always have springtime allergies, and they've kicked in. And so just bear with me, if you don't mind. Several years ago, I was in the office, so it wasn't here. And I picked up the phone, and there was a lady needing something. And what she wanted was her rent paid. And she kept talking and talking and talking. And I finally said, ma'am, you're living with somebody, right? Yeah. And I said, and you're not married to him, right? She said, that's right. And I said, and you're wanting a church to pay your rent for y'all to live together. Is that right? That's right. I said, well, I told her how we did things, and I said, but I can tell you now, he's probably not going to okay that. Why not? I said, well, you're living together without the benefit of marriage. And church does not condone that. Judge not that you be not judged. And she slammed the phone and hung up. Enough people know this verse, but they don't understand it. Enough people think that this verse says one thing when reality is it says completely different. And yet, it's, as we said, it's probably in many ways it may be as known as the 23rd Psalm. In Matthew chapter 7, and we'll not go through all the rigmarole that we've been going through with regards to context and all, because we've been studying in the Sermon on the Mount for the last couple of weeks. But it is in the midst of this great sermon that as the first verse, of the 7th chapter begins, it says, judge not that you be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with what measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but you do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite. First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you shall see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, let's go on next verse, because this kind of finishes the whole thought. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under the feet and turn and tear you in pieces. Judge not that you be not judged is, of course, not a question. But if you look in verse 3, here's the question. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Why do you look at the speck? Why do you look at the splinter versus the beam, some versions use, which is more accurate in many ways? We ask that question, we look at it, we understand that God is looking at us from the standpoint of, he says, let's don't judge. Well, like I say, we've used that verse. But here comes the problem. Jump down to that last verse we looked at, verse 6. Don't give what is holy to the dogs and cast your pearls before swines. That's judging. So in other words, these verses are not condemning the idea of you can't judge at all. Now, we're going to come back to that thought. I'm going to introduce several thoughts this morning before I come back to any of them. There's thought. We judge. Well, verse 1 says we can't, but verse 6 says evidently we can. So we have a problem. Not really, but we'll leave it at that for the time being. Then if you look in verse 2, he says, if you judge, notice what he says, with what judgment you judge, you'll be judged. Implying then that, yes, you'll be judged. But if you judge others, and the criteria that you use to judge other individuals, that's going to come back and get you. That's going to come back and haunt you because folks are going to use the same. There's no thought. And then if you look at verse 5, what's the first word? Hypocrite. That would imply judgment, wouldn't it? Because we're going to have to determine if someone is saying one thing and doing another. Hypocrite, hypocrites. It's the idea of an actor. One who, literally, the word means one who wears a mask. But in biblical times, much like Shakespeare, if you ever studied Shakespeare, you know that one actor on Shakespeare's plays could play several different parts because they often wore masks. Well, that was true in biblical times as well. That an actor would wear a mask, and so he might play this part over here, and then in another scene he might play a different part, or she might play a different part. And so the word hypocrite is really that word, one who wears a mask. It's the idea of one who plays a role. Hypocrite. Then he says, first remove the plank from your own eye. Well, what is this? What is this teaching? Well, first of all, it's not teaching that we have to be perfect. You and I cannot be perfect. We're not perfect. John, remember in 1 John, what did he write? He says, if we say we have no sin, we do what? Yeah, we lie. We deceive ourselves. We lie. We lie to ourselves. And the truth's not in us. So, the Bible is not saying here, the Lord is not saying here in the Sermon on the Mount, you got to be perfect. Can't be perfect. None of us are going to be perfect. And as we've already said, we've thrown out several ideas. Let's just talk about this idea of judging. You can't judge. That's not what he's talking about. You can't judge. Look with me at a couple of different passages. We'll not look at them in length, but I want you to kind of get the idea. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. When we're going to go to the book of 1 Corinthians on Wednesday nights pretty soon. No, Sunday morning, excuse me. Pretty soon. Like I say, 1st of May, we'll be in this book. But in 1 Corinthians 5, I ask you to just kind of remember your own studies. It's the idea of the practice of church discipline. It's probably... what someone wrote several years ago is probably the most ignored verses in all the Bible with regards to the church. We don't do it. And there are a lot of reasons why we should, more reasons why we should than that we do. But nevertheless, we don't, sadly. But if you go back and think about what's happening, there's immorality in the church at Corinth. And Paul is admonishing the church at Corinth to find that individual or seek that individual, pull that individual out, and work, if you will, with that individual. And the whole idea of church discipline is not to mark somebody and to say you're a terrible, awful person. The whole idea of church discipline is to bring that soul back, to cause them to want to come back. Not to just say, you're terrible, we're done with you. That's not the purpose of church discipline. But, and we'll talk more about that when we get to 1 Corinthians here in a few weeks. But if you think about what he's saying, he says there's problem in the church. With regards to this immoral individual. Excuse me. And then verse 9, beginning, he talks about how to judge that immorality. And so there's the idea of judging. Well, let's look at one or two others. Let's just think about, if you will, 3 John. In 3 John, we read, especially in verse 9, John says, I wrote to the church by Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to putting them out of the church. Beloved, we do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil does not seek God. Think about it. John says that when we come, Diotrephes has treated us wrong. He's used words, he's said things about us that are wrong, incorrect. He's been unkind. And he says, I'm going to talk to him. Well, that would imply, at least on John's part, what? He's judging. And so we have to go back. And so now go back to Matthew chapter 7. Okay. John is not telling us, or excuse me, Jesus is not telling. Did I say John 7? Don't listen to what I say. Think ahead of me. Matthew 7. I'm sorry. It just dawned in my empty brain what I was thinking. Matthew 7. In that, we have to ask ourselves, what is Jesus talking about? And what he's talking about is an individual that is the fault finder. He's finding fault. It's not the individual that sits down and cannot judge. Now, think about this for a minute. Let's kind of jump off the deep end for a minute. Our society is becoming more and more what's called woke, and there's a lot of different definitions to that, and to be honest, you have your definition and I have my definition. But wokeism in part, not in totality, but in part is this idea that you cannot sit in judgment of anybody else on anything. Now, like I say, that's not all of it. That's just part of it. But it's the idea that everybody, if you think about it, everybody's right. And nobody's wrong. And with everybody being right and nobody being wrong, you can't say then, well, this one's wrong, this one did wrong, this one over here it shouldn't be this way. It becomes to a point of where nothing is wrong. That's Jesus is not saying that. He's not saying, number one, you can't judge. He's not saying, number two, that there's no sense of what is right and wrong. Because if I find out that somebody is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's my responsibility as minister, and it's my responsibility, but number one, as Christian, to go talk to that individual. Now, let me tell you, sadly, I've made some folks enemies, and I didn't intend on it. You know, they were not walking in the way they should walk, and go and lovingly talk to them, and just explain to them, let's get back in the right way. And oh, you're judging. Oh, you're being critical. Oh, no, what's the Bible say? Let's just look what the Bible says. Let's think about it. And you think about it and see what you come up with. This judgment, though, of Matthew that Jesus is talking about is the idea of finding fault with an individual without cause. It's the fault finder. It's the critic. It's the individual that wants to look at someone and say, you know, this is what's wrong with you. Your tie doesn't match your suit. If that ever happens, that's probably true. It's probably my wife's fault, though, because she dresses me. But at the same point in time, too, you might say, you know, your car's ugly. Okay, you think so. To be honest, it's what I could afford. Your child is not as smart as you think that he is. I don't know. He's pretty smart. Pretty smart. Anybody can pass all the CPA tests on his own, basically. He's a pretty smart kid. He got that from his father's side of the family, but we won't talk about that. Definitely skipped a generation. Probably skipped a couple. But, you know, you go on and on and on and on and on. And we're bad about that. Did you see so-and-so's dress? You know, that's in the car going home. That's the ugliest thing I've seen in my life. Did you see so-and-so's hair? It's so long. Yes, mine is. Jackie's hopefully just got word going to go back to work. Give her a call and see if she can cut my hair sometime soon. But, and remember Jackie Sexton, remember Randy's family and your prayers. But, you know, his hair is too long. I had a guy that came to me back, this has been several years ago, and my car had gone on the brink. And I mean, it was almost toes up, and it was in the shop, and Suzanne's grandmother was still alive at the time, and she had a truck, and she let us borrow her truck, pickup truck. The car was going to be in the shop 2-3 weeks, and so she let us borrow her truck, and I had an elder come in, and he said, "Are you driving that truck?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And the reason he knew I was driving the truck was because something I never had liked before, didn't like while I was there, and don't like it since. I had an assigned parking place. Had a sign in front, Brother Paul's parking place. Don't ever do that to me. Don't like it. Probably from now on, I'm old enough now, I wouldn't park there. But anyway, he came in, he said, "Is that your truck?" And I said, "Yes, sir." Preachers aren't supposed to drive trucks. Well, I swallowed my tongue real hard. And then I said, well, let's just be honest. I said, right now it's better than to my car's shop, and this is my wife's grandmother's truck, and she's let us borrow it. My own mother had a judgment. If a preacher came to try out and he was wearing cowboy boots, say she couldn't have been in Texas. She didn't want him. It didn't matter how good he was. We all do stuff like that. We all have our certain standards, if you will, about everything. Now we got pie/dessert night tonight. And you may fix something that might not be my favorite. I'll still like it, but it may not be my favorite. And, you know, we'll have to, well, if you ask me, I'll tell you, well, you know, it's pretty good. It's sort of like, got to be careful, though, if you ask that question. Thomas Taylor, who's long since passed on, was an elder in the congregation in West Tennessee when I was a whole lot younger. And this lady came up and said, she was well known for her pecan pie. And she said, "Oh," Thomas said, "How was my pecan pie?" And he said, "Do you want to know the truth?" And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you want to know the truth?" And she said, "Yeah, how was it?" She thought, you know, oh, this is prize winning. This is fair competition. And he said, "Your pecans were a little stale." So she turned around in a huff She came back the next church service. She evidently had gone and tested her pecans. She came back. She said, "You were right. They were stale." We have to be careful with people because, like I say, we have that own standard. And notice what Jesus says. He says, "Be careful." Why? Because he says you're looking at your brother, and he only has a splinter, and you have this beam in your own eye. Be careful. Your class is a whole lot more fun. Let's go back there. See, you and I have to be careful when we begin to make judgment of others. So what's Jesus talking about? Well, he's talking about the hypercritical. He's talking about the individual that is so self-righteous that he's finding, if you will, he's finding something bad with everybody else. Probably because he thinks that this will make him so much better. Probably most, if not all of us, grew up or listened to or watched Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite went to his wife one night and talked about all the news people and how that he was so much better. And his wife finally looked at him. She said, "There's probably one less newscaster that's as good as you think they are." See, sometimes we have to look at that. Look in Luke chapter 18. Luke 18, beginning in verse 9, Jesus spoke a parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, and even as this tax collector." Did you catch that? Look what he says. "I thank you that I'm not as other men. I'm not an extortioner, unjust, adulterer, and I'm not even like this old guy right over here, this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess." He stuck his chest out. Ooh, look at me. Look how great I am. And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not as much raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself shall be humbled, and he who humbles himself shall be exalted. Probably within the near future, we're going to talk about humility. I've been kind of on a very small study of humility myself because it's an interesting subject. It's one of those, if you think about humility is one of those things that when you think you've got it, you don't have it. It's really easy to say, I give of my means in contribution. I take the Lord's Supper. I sing. I pray. I show kindness and compassion. Measurable traits that God gives us. But then he says, I want you to be humble. And really, when you say, I got it, you don't have it. It's just an interesting thought. But in Luke chapter 18, there we have one that says, "Oh, look at me." And one that says, you look and you think, boy, there's a difference in contrast of people. The hypercritical that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 7 is the fault finder that sees himself as the one that is so great that everyone else fails in comparison to him or her. The fault finder, the hypercritical, the if you will, the individual looking for the speck. Their actions are often motivated by selfishness. In other words, I want to make sure that no one gets ahead of me, at least in my own mind. And so if I bring them down a level, then look how great I am. The fault finder, the hypercritical, often wants to console a biting conscience. I'm not as bad as he is, or I'm not as bad as she is. In other words, they don't say that, but the idea is, did you see what she did? I'm better than that. Look in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. Paul says, "For we dare not class ourselves or commend ourselves with those who commend themselves, but they measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves are not wise." Have you ever heard the expression, "a chain is only as strong as its what? Weakest link." And that's true, right? We had a old dog, or actually I did. I got it my senior year of college. I got it this summer in between my junior and senior year. And I convinced mom and dad to take care of it. And that when I graduated in May, I would take the dog. And the dog unfortunately got killed by a car in April before I took it in May. But anyway, Sparky was on a chain tied in the backyard. And I noticed I had bought the chain, I had fixed it all. And I noticed when I went out to put all that up, well, I actually moved it with us when we got married. Well, that was May, and we got married in July. But anyway, um, that he had so worn, it was a week. It was cheap. I was a college student. It was cheap, and he had worn it out. It had a couple of places where evidently Dad had repaired it. But that's very true. A chain's only as strong as its weakest link. And so when we think about that, here we are, we're trying to make folks, feel down to us. And so we're trying to find fault with them because we're trying to say, I may not be there yet, but I'm going to get there, but I'm going to bring them down so that I feel good about me. And so Jesus is talking about this individual. He says, don't do that. Don't be the individual that tries to find fault with everybody. There's another problem with the fault finder. The fault finder usually does not have all the facts. God has all the facts. Fault finder, the individual that's trying to find fault with individuals, doesn't have all the facts. They don't know everything. They don't know why. Back a few years ago, on Thursdays at lunch, I took the boys out to eat pizza every Thursday at lunch. And so we would all meet at a particular pizza place, and we would eat. And so one day I met them there. When I came back out, and you got to remember now, when I came back out, it was a big parking lot. My car was parked just a little bit crooked. And the reason it was parked that way was because of the car that I was parking next to was a little crooked. And so I had to be a little crooked to fit in. I was still within the lines. But when I came out of the restaurant, being with the boys, there was a note on my car that talked about if I couldn't park any better than this, I wouldn't park, and doo-dah, 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 doo-dah. And I'm thinking, I parked this way because of the two cars on either side of me and the way I had to park. But you've sat in judgment of me, and so you evidently think that you know everything about it all. I'd like to have known who that was and go and see how straight their car was, and if it was right in the middle of the parking place. Well, that's what's wrong with the fault finder. So he ultimately hurts himself, doesn't he? Well, why? Well, he binds himself to his own faults. He puts out his eyes really to the virtues of others, because what he's looking for is the bad, right? He's looking for the thing that they don't like in somebody else, in their actions, in their attitudes, in their dress, in their life. He's looking for the bad. The speaker once held up this huge piece of white paper, and in the middle of it was a very small black dot, very small. Write down what you see. Well, you would think most people would say, I see a beautiful sheet of white paper. Most people said, I see a little black dot in the middle of a piece of paper. We see what we're looking for. And we can tell our attitudes. Well, you see, the fault finder, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for the bad, the ugly, the wrong. They're not looking for the beautiful flower. They're looking for the buzzard. They're not looking for the bumblebee. They're thinking about the sting of the bumblebee. They're not looking for the good. They're looking for the bad, at least what they judge to be bad, so that they can judge others. Something somebody like to say or add. I want to end this on a happier note. That's something somebody like to say. Right. Very much so. Very much so. Anything else? Just a day or two. You're only 29, Billy. You're only 29. I think, yeah, with regards to that, I think we've lost a sense of respect. And that goes in a lot of different categories. Respect for each other, respect for God, respect for His Word, respect for the fact that there is a standard that God has given to us. And then you take all of that, if you will, the spiritual side, and you put it against people, and like I said, the respect for people. And so, yes, I agree with you. Yeah, 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 yeah. Right. Sure, sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Very true. James that you refer to, I think it's James, is it James 4? Not a doer of the law, but a judge. I think it's James 4. It's a good reference. Yeah. James 4, verse 11, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. Who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. One lawgiver who is able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge another? Good point. Anything else? Well, like I said, I want to kind of end this on a little higher note. I realize that in many ways we're all in this boat. And while we should make righteous judgments about others and not hypercritical judgments of others, we need to be very careful. We need to, how do we go about doing this in the right way? I guess is the way I want to conclude this today. Well, let me give you, I've got 10 listed here. I probably won't get through all of them, but give you a few that before you go about finding fault, here's some things you need to do. First of all, you need to pause and be sure that your heart's in the right place. In other words, if I'm going to be critical of you, I need to be sure that my criticism of you is going to help you. That it's not to belittle you, to bring you down, but it's to help you. Now, you've heard me say before, I had one sweet lady, and I can call her sweet now because she's passed away. She called me to her house one day. Yes, ma'am, you need to come to my house. Yes, ma'am. You know that sermon you preached yesterday? Yes, ma'am. It stunk. I never did tell her that was probably how long we were in Bradford? 5 years? That the 5 years, that was probably the most positive feedback of any sermons that I preached. I know what it was. We're preaching, or I preached on elders, and I commended our elders, and she hated our elders. And so that's what that was all about. But needless to say, you get those things. Well, everybody has their opinion, and what sermon will affect one will not affect the other. I still am reminded of a story I think I shared with you. My brother-in-law, back quite a few years ago, shared with me. He, at that time, was leading singing from time to time. Vernon led a song that was an older song on Sunday night, and then after church, there were several folks at their house to eat, and somebody of course they were younger, and somebody said something about it, and he said, well, Sister so-and-so thanked me for leading it because it was sung at her husband's funeral. So what means something to one does not always mean something to the other. And so one sermon means something to one does not necessarily mean it to the other. But we have to be very careful. And so we have to, if we're going to be critical of others, let's make sure our heart's in the right place. We're doing it to help and not to hurt. Secondly, examine your own life to see if everything's in order. What's the old saying? People in glass houses do what? Need to be careful. Don't throw stones. It's not to say that you can't have a standard. And don't walk away and say, well, Brother Paul says we can't have a standard. We've all got a standard. Standard's the Bible. We've all got a standard about how things should be done, yes. But let's understand that when we begin to talk about others, we have to look and make sure that our house is pretty clean. Now, is it going to be perfect? No, we said that in the very beginning. We're not going to live perfect lives. But as fault finders, we need to spend a little time examining ourselves. Thirdly, try to put yourself in their place. Look in Romans 15. Romans 15. Don't talk about the dirty boy that walks down the street, needs a bath, until you find out if he has access to a bath, if he has access to soap, if he has access to good parents that tell him that he needs good personal hygiene. We then that are strong ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, leading to edification. Let each of us please. The word please there is the idea of service. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, for the purpose of what? Edifying, bringing up one another. Last time I really thought about this is, I think, important. I believe that when we go into heaven, when judgment occurs, we're all going to go in together. We're not going to go in piecemeal. You might say, well, preacher, you don't get that from scriptures. And you're right. But think about walking hand in hand into heaven with your fellow brother and sister in Christ. As opposed to, I got in, well, then maybe they'll get in later. Think about the fact that we're striving, or should be striving, to help one another. And not just us, but we should strive to help those in the community. Those folks, next door, right down the street from us. And so next, we need to remember God is merciful towards us. God is merciful towards us. Isn't that a wonderful thought? We don't have time, but Matthew chapter 18, beginning verse 21 through verse 35, reminds us of God's mercy. God's mercy towards us. God is merciful God. And if God is merciful towards us, we ought to be merciful towards one another. Next, consider the benevolence of others. In other words, think about what others have done to you, the kindness that others have shown you, the good that others have given to you. Next, remember the hurt you felt the last time someone criticized you. You ever been criticized? Sure, we all have. We all have. There's not a one of us in here that somebody didn't take us off to the side and take us to the woodshed. Well, we begin to do that to somebody else. Let's be careful that we not only show them the mercy that God shows us, but that we remember the hurt the last time we felt. And so let's cushion what we say. Next, pray for your brethren. We talk about that so much, but it is so true. Next, go to them in humility and love. Next, be sure you ask this question. Is it true? Is it true what I understand from them, but is it true what I'm feeling? And am I right? Do I have all the information? And then I have to ask myself, what good going to them is going to do? Will it help them? Am I going to try to help them? Anything else? All right. Like I said, next week I'll be absent. The week after, so we've got, let's see, that's the 14th. We got the 21st and 28th of questions, and then we will flip over to 1 Corinthians. Anything else? Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for today, for the blessing of it, for the opportunity that we have to study your word, for the fact that it is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path, that it teaches us how to live. And we ask that we may always be individuals that look to your word first and let your word direct us in our lives. Help us to have a loving spirit. Help us to be loving people. Help us to be people that want to be with others, but want to help them as well. Watch over us, bless us, keep us, forgive us of our sins. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Have a great week. See y'all.